Hello and welcome to Serial Killers. Today we will be continuing Volume 3 with the biography of Nannie Doss, a more unfamiliar serial killer with the general public. She has also been known as the Giggling Granny, the Giggling Nanny, the Jolly Black Widow, Lady Bluebeard, the Lonely Hearts Killer, and a few others. She has a victim count of at least 8, but more likely she is believed to have committed 11 murders. So let's begin Nannie Doss. Nannie Doss was born Nancy Hazel on November 4th, 1905, in a poor farming community in Blue Mountain, Alabama, to Louisa Nolder and James F. Hazel. Nancy soon earned the nickname Nannie for her sweet personality, as she also loved to laugh. Nannie was the oldest of 5 children, and being on a farm, especially in a poor farming community, her schooling was put on hold so that she could help with the farm work and support the family. Usually, she would also watch her younger siblings, who are named May, Dovey, Addie, and William. Nannie was expected to act like a sweet, gentle farm wife in order to prepare for her adult life in domesticity. But the Hazel household was very miserable, with money and food in short supply due to the fact, again, poor farming community, and there was the constant threat of poverty looming. And because of this, Nannie's father, James Hazel, took on a very controlling persona and was very cruel. He forbade his wife and daughters from going to any social events, forbade them to wear any makeup or clothing he personally deemed inappropriate. Of course, James Hazel rationalized, claiming that he was just keeping them on the farm to protect them, but really he just wanted to keep control over his family with this constant threat of poverty looming over him. This is how he's sort of coping. Nannie is believed to have been raped by, or said to have been raped by, local men in her youth. And when she told her father, he simply denied or didn't believe Nannie, or he just simply didn't care that she was molested. Of course, this type of experience would have great psychological trauma, especially for someone so young. Nannie began to dream about the perfect Prince Charming to sweep Nannie off her feet and take care of her and save Nannie from her tragic circumstances she was living in. She would often spend hours locking herself away with her mother's romance novels and magazines to imagine a world where she was truly loved and not taken advantage of, as well as the Lonely Hearts columns in newspapers. When Nannie was 7 years old, she was traveling with her family on a train when the train suddenly stopped and Nannie hit her head on a metal pole, possibly causing her to suffer from severe brain damage. But we'll talk about more of that a little later. So this is the type of romance novel that Nannie Doss would have read in her youth at the time. She continued to read these type of things throughout the rest of her life. Those type of magazines. Jump ahead a little bit. When Nannie was 16 years old, she was pressured into marrying a man named Charlie Briggs, who worked at the same linen factory Nannie was working at. The two had only met 4 months before, but James Hazel most likely wanted Nannie to marry so he would have one less person to support. Again, poor farming community. Nannie believed that Charlie Braggs would grant her the freedom she always dreamed of. However, Nannie's new mother-in-law was just as cruel and controlling as her father was. The mother-in-law believed that her son Charlie could do nothing wrong, but Nannie was incapable of doing even the most basic tasks correctly. But she herself never would help with the housework. Nannie later said, quote, "I married, as my father wished in 1921, to a boy I only knowed about 4 or 5 months, who had no family, only a mother who was unwed and who had taken over my life completely when we were married. She never seen anything anything wrong with what she'd done, but she would take spells. She would not, wait, she would not let my own mother stay all night. Nanny's mother-in-law also limited who Nanny could talk to and where and when Nanny was allowed to go outside of the house. Over the course of their marriage, Nanny and Charlie had 4 children: Melvin, Florine, Gertrude, and Zelmer Braggs, and quick financial stability. However, Charlie was commonly unfaithful to Nanny. So, despite being able to uh, raise 4 children and having more financial stability than with his father, Nanny's still not quite finding that perfect life she's been fantasizing about. And if you remember, fantasies contribute a lot to serial murder. But we'll talk about more of that later. Nanny often retaliated with Charlie's infidelity as well by committing infidelity of her own. And with the stress of being a single housewife, doing most of the work, especially at a very young age, drove Nanny to excessive drinking and smoking. Nannie Doss is believed to have first poisoned her 2 middle children, who were toddlers at the time, in early 1927. Charlie returned home to find his 2 daughters, Gertrude and Zelmer, in pain from what Nanny claimed was food poisoning. The 2 girls soon died afterwards on September 25th, 1923. No suspicion was raised, and neither of the girls received an autopsy, and so it just went unnoticed. However, Charlie Braggs took his eldest daughter, Melvin, and fled, leaving baby Florine Braggs behind in Nanny's care. Charlie Braggs later said, quote, "When she got mad, I wouldn't eat anything she fixed or drank anything out around the house." However, when concerning this quote, this was said after Nanny's arrest and her crimes were revealed, and so it could be that Charlie Braggs was simply trying to get money from Nanny's publicity. Considering the specifics of wouldn't drink or eat anything around the house or that she made. Charlie Braggs returned a year later with Melvin with a new girlfriend, asking Nanny for a divorce. If Nanny agreed, Charlie said that Melvin would be able to return into Nanny's care. Nanny agreed, and Charlie Braggs and Nannie Doss, or Nanny Hazel at this point, well, Nanny Braggs, Nanny, got a divorce. Charlie Braggs was Nanny's only husband to actually survive their marriage. Nanny was now a single mother supporting her 2 daughters, and so she moved back in with her mother and got a job at the local cotton mill. Nanny returned to reading her romance novels and Lonely Hearts columns to dream of the perfect man to treat Nanny right. She often wrote letters to local bachelors that she found in the personal ads of the newspapers. Eventually, Nanny found a man named Frank. Why do I have such a hard time with the names? Harrelson, I think, hoping he was her Prince Charming. Frank Harrelson was a 23-year-old factory worker from Jacksonville. Frank wrote romantic letters and poetry to Nanny, and so Nanny moved to Jacksonville in order to marry Frank at the age of 24 in 1929. However, Nanny soon learned that Frank was an alcoholic and cheated on Nanny regularly, just as Charlie had done to her. Frank also had a criminal record of assault and would beat Nanny whenever he got too drunk. Also, the romantic talk that Nanny so adored stopped once they were married. However, despite the abuse, Nanny was married to Frank for 16 years. Throughout the marriage, Nanny's conditions began to worsen rapidly as both Nanny and Frank drank alcohol constantly in order to cope with the threat of poverty, which was still looming constantly. And as a result, Nanny was also very desperate to stay out of poverty. In the 1940s, Nannie's eldest daughter, Melvin, recently married and had a son named Robert Lee Haynes. Of course, Haynes being the last name of Melvin's husband, and also had a second on the way. Nannie, unfortunately, saw a very terrible yet easy way to get money and avoid poverty, and so few Nannie took out a life insurance policy on her grandson Robert for $500, which is the modern equivalent of $7,000. Melvina often left Robert in Nannie's care to sort of babysit when she was busy. And one day, Robert died suddenly while under Nannie's care on July 7th, 1945. Doctors were stumped on what happened, but Robert's cause of death was labeled as asphyxia. In Nannie's later confession, she never clearly told police how she killed Robert. But soon after Robert's death, she collected the money from the life insurance policy she took out on him. Nannie may have also killed her second grandchild, but Nannie never confessed to it. So, it remains undetermined. However, Malvina's second pregnancy ended up with a very difficult birth, and Nannie assisted in the birth, and soon afterwards the baby was born. However, the infant died soon afterwards, and doctors attributed the death to natural causes. However, Malvina believed she thought she saw Nannie stick a hat pin into the baby's head while Nannie was holding the infant in her arms. However, given the fact that Melvina was still groggy from the birth and the ether that was used to sedate her, Melvina couldn't be sure if she actually saw Nannie kill the baby, and so she never reported anything to police. In September 1945, after the end of World War II and the Japanese surrender, most of Americans celebrated, and so, following suit, Nannie's husband Frank went out for a night of especially heavy drinking, and when Frank got home, he raped Nannie in a drunken stupor. The next morning, Nannie found Frank's jug of corn whiskey on the lawn outside, and so she grabbed it and filled the jug with liquid rat poison, which contains a very high concentration of arsenic, which of course is a very toxic chemical. Frank died later that evening on September 16th, 1945, with similar symptoms to Nannie's two deceased children. Police and doctors ruled Frank death to be natural causes since he was an alcoholic, and no autopsy was performed. After Frank's death, Nannie left Jacksonville, Alabama to start fresh. Again, turning to Lonely Hearts columns, romance novels, and magazines to fuel her fantasy life, and to look for potential husbands and supporters. Nannie spent the next few years traveling throughout the south of the United States, never staying in one place for too long. Nannie eventually arrived in Lexington, North Carolina, and saw an ad by a man named Arlie Lanning. And so Nannie sent Arlie a letter, and the two met and were married only 3 days later. Arlie was also an alcoholic and also cheated on Nannie, but was not physically abusive, so progress, right? However, Nannie began to take long trips away from home and not wanting to be a housewife to another alcoholic husband and being very unhappy in the marriage. Nannie's marriage to Arlie lasted about 2.5 years until Arlie died on February 16th, 1952, from what appeared to be heart failure after a meal of stewed prunes and coffee. Of course, this was made by Nannie. Arlie began to experience flu-like symptoms with a fever, vomiting, and had stomach pains. He died shortly afterwards, a little while after his condition worsened. This is, of course, common with arsenic poisoning. Doctors again noticed Arlie's history of drinking and concluded the alcohol took too much of a toll on his body to fight off a flu. And so Plus, the fact that a flu was going around at the time, again, no autopsy was performed. A few days after the funeral, which is pictured here on the left of the screen, we have Nannie Doss looking a little mournful with two unidentified people, possibly friends or relatives, who knows. Point is, they're unidentified. However, a few days after the funeral, Arlie's house burned down, and the insurance money, of course, went to the widow Nannie. Nannie then went to stay with Arlie's mother just a few blocks away, and she was a very kind woman who allowed Nannie to stay until she got back on her feet from the tragic circumstances. However, Arlie's mother soon died under mysterious circumstances as well. After that, Nannie left town soon after, and no foul play was suspected given Arlie's mother's old age. This is, of course, Arlie Lanning's gravestone. Nannie returned to Alabama, her home state, to her bedridden sister, Dovey, who is dying of cancer. She soon died after Nannie's arrival. Nannie again collected the life insurance money and left town soon after. Nannie then signed up for a dating agency, which was called Diamond Circle Club. That is where she met Richard L. Morton in 1952 in Jamestown, North Carolina. Richard Morton rarely drank and treated Nannie very well, and the two married in Emporia, Kansas, soon after meeting. So, you think, finally a good husband. One that isn't abusing her, not cheating, and doesn't drink. Great. But, however, a few days after, hold on. In 1953, Nannie invited her mother, Louisa Hazel, to visit and meet her new husband. However, a few days after she arrived, she complained of stomach cramps, and her condition later worsened until she finally died on January 3rd, 1953. After Louisa's death, Nannie discovered that Richard was seeing one of his old girlfriends on the side, and so Richard Morton died 3 months after Louisa's death under the same circumstances on May 19th, 1953. Nannie again left town soon afterwards. Sorry, ignore that. I apologize. This is Nannie's mother's gravestone. This is the certificate of death for the mother, I think. I'm pretty sure. Yes. Yeah. By 1953, Nannie was approaching her 50s and had been married 4 times. Eligible husbands became harder to find, yet Nannie was able to meet a man named Samuel Doss, who recently lost his family in a tragic accident when a tornado in Arkansas killed his wife and 9 children. Samuel Doss recently moved to Tulsa, Oklahoma to escape his grief and met Nannie. Nannie used her own husband's and family's death to get close to Samuel, and the two married soon afterwards in June of 1953. Samuel was not an alcoholic, was not abusive, and didn't cheat on Nannie even once. So, even better than Robert Morton. However, Samuel was a Nazarene minister who couldn't stand the foolishness of Nannie's romance novels, something that has been, a very strong part of her identity. And Samuel also kept tight control of money, so Nannie couldn't buy things that she wanted to. Nannie threatened to leave Samuel if he didn't give Nannie access to the checking account, and so Samuel eventually gave Nannie access to the checking account. Nannie later took out 2 life insurance policies on Samuel, as Nannie being the sole benefactor. Then on September 1954, Nannie baked Samuel a prune pie and soon fell ill. However, Samuel went to the hospital and eventually recovered. Nannie decides that she needed to change her normal MO of slowly poisoning, as Samuel would go to the hospital again, and instead increased her dose of arsenic in Samuel's morning coffee. This time, Samuel died in just minutes on October 12th, 1954. Doctors were suspicious of Samuel's sudden death after recovering in the hospital, and so an autopsy was finally performed on his body. Ironically, Nannie signed the papers of consent in order to perform the autopsy, without which they wouldn't have been able to. This might have caused suspicion, but she would never have been able to be really convicted of a crime. During the autopsy, coroners found enough arsenic in Samuel's body to kill 40 horses, making foul play undeniable. Investigators immediately turned to Nannie, who was last to see Samuel alive, and also served coffee to Samuel before he died. This is Samuel Doss's gravestone. Police brought Nannie in for questioning, and Nannie tried to play innocent, but didn't seem like a grieving widow. But yet she also didn't seem like a cold-blooded killer as questioning progressed. During this questioning, she would often laugh, make jokes, and chatted kindly with the officers. Every time police tried to get a confession, Nannie avoided the question. Police looked into Nannie's background and found about the deaths of her husbands and family members. And when police asked Nannie about her fourth husband, Richard Morton, Nannie claimed that she never even heard about him, but police had a wedding certificate and now had enough evidence to charge Nannie with the murder of Samuel Doss. Nannie then agreed to confess, but on the condition that the confiscated romance novel the police had be returned to her. Nannie then confessed to killing 8 people, 4 of her husbands, her mother, her sister Dovey, her first grandson Robert, and her mother-in-law, Arlie Lanning's mother, as well as she also said to be communicating with a potential 6th husband after she left town. However, Nannie never confessed to the deaths of her 2 daughters and her second grandson, which she is suspected in, making her possible victim count, of course, 11. Police exhumed the bodies of the 8 victims Nannie confessed to and performed an autopsy, and of course arsenic was found in all of their bodies. After Nannie's confession, her case exploded in popularity with press and the media. Police were shocked to read about what the newspaper nicknamed her: the Giggling Granny, Lonely Hearts Killer, Black Widow, and Lady Bluebeard. Of course, Lady Bluebeard refers to an old French folk tale where this wealthy man named Bluebeard would kill his wives and kill his wives, usually for money. That's where that comes from. Who committed so many murders for so long without showing any type of empathy. The press especially picked up on Nannie's laughter during her confession and in court. People were just fascinated and terrified at the same about Annie's attitude to facing life in prison or even execution by the electric chair. Nannie once said to a reporter who asked why she killed her husband Samuel Doss, quote, "Well, that's simple, darling. He got on my nerves." Nannie Doss at first pled not guilty, but later changed her plea to guilty on May 17th, 1955. During Nannie's trial, her laughing and seemingly lack of understanding of the gravity of her crimes caused the judge to doubt her mental state. Not wanting to execute an old woman with a seemingly unstable mindset, the judge sentenced her to life in prison. Nannie Doss was only prosecuted for the murder of Samuel Doss and never got the other 9 she confessed to or the 3 she did not confess to. In prison, Nannie's health began to deteriorate, and in an interview, Nannie said the following, quote, "Time passes slowly here in the prison. Behind my smile is a heavy heart. I've always made people think I was happy even though I wasn't. My daughter is ill in North Carolina, and that worries me. I should be at her side nursing her back to health. I've just lost my desire to live. While I was in here, I've had 2 heart attacks. Mild ones, nothing that couldn't keep me down. Maybe the Lord will take me soon. Eventually, Nannie Doss died on June 2nd, 1965, from leukemia at the Oklahoma State Penitentiary Hospital ward on the 10th anniversary of her incarceration at the age of 60 years old. Ironically, arsenic exposure over long periods of time has been known to cause cancer in people, so it's very possible that years of Annie's use of arsenic to kill her victims gave her the cancer that killed her. So here is some photos of Nannie's time in court with lawyers and stuff. There's one of her more famous photos of her smiling. I'm not entirely sure who these people are. Most likely her attorneys or just people, but as you can see, her glowing personality, just smiling on her way to court. No big deal. Some newspapers from the Tulsa Daily World. A widow admits poisoning 4 mates. Still says her conscience is clear. List of possible victims reaches 12. Wait, 12? What's this 12 I'm hearing of? I can't read this. I'm not entirely sure what this 12 victims about. Nannie Doss pleads guilty to murder of Tulsa mate, faces life, term, or death. Little picture of her in the newspaper. French controversy of airstrike. French conceived idea of airstrike from Kerry. I don't know. I'm getting off topic. Oklahoma woman admits feeding poison to 2. This is interesting enough, despite the kind of rocky relationship with murdering possibly 2 of her children and other family. This is Nannie Doss with her eldest daughter Melvina and her grandchildren in a later photo around the time she was arrested and at trial, around May 31st. Although you can see Melvina is kind of like giving a stern look while holding her grandchildren. As you can infer, she had 2 other children after the other 2 died, possibly both from Nannie's care. Just so smiling. You can see where she got the nickname the Giggling Granny. This is her gravestone. Beloved mother, ain't that ironic? So let's start with the psychological profile. Nannie's experiences with men in childhood were uniformly cruel, from her father's psychological abuse to being raped, and so Nannie desperately wanted, in fact needed, a man in her life that would treat her with love and respect. And so Nannie fantasized about the perfect man, her Prince Charming, to come and save her. This desire for romance would fuel her darker desires later in life and would lead Nannie to deeply desire attention from men while also distrusting them. It is possible that the head injury from the metal pole, if you remember that, affected her brain and gave her antisocial behavior or increased her mental instability from a traumatic brain injury or TBI, which is known to cause personality changes like Phineas Gage. Nannie possibly chose to kill her 2 children while married to Charlie Braggs as an act of revenge on Charlie for being unfaithful to Nannie. Another possible reason is that Nannie had Munchausen syndrome by proxy and wanted to seem like a good mother from all the stresses of being a thick caregiver was kind of weighing on her, so she wanted to convey that image in a very bad way, and it went sideways and they died, or she wanted them to die and wanted to receive sympathy as the grieving mother. Having a loveless marriage, 4 children, and a criticizing mother-in-law by nursing her children back to health would have given her such a boost of confidence. However, it's possible Nannie gave them too much poison for their bodies to deal with, and they died. If Nannie did have Munchausen syndrome by proxy or as it is now known as fictitious disorder inflicted upon another, but that's a mouthful. Nannie's motives later changed to financial gain, or the mistake of killing her children could have exposed her to the idea of killing, which is common. Most serial killers will fantasize about committing simpler crimes, usually rape, especially for male killers, and then something goes wrong and they end up killing them, and they feel this rush of emotional high and gratification, and then they switch to full-on willing homicide. And that homicide later increases as they escalate and need more to get that same emotional high, like a drug addict, which we can possibly see from her later progression of victims, because she's starting to her later victims aren't for financial gain, and they're not really for any particular reason. While married to Frank Harrelson, Nannie stayed married for 16 years, even despite the abuse, most likely because she felt like there was no other way for her to support herself and her family, still keeping in her mind to desperately avoid poverty, contributing to her motive of financial gain, that desperation to avoid poverty. And especially in the 1930s and 40s, poverty was an extremely big issue. Plus, the move to Jacksonville to marry Frank Harrelson kind of drained her finances. So she's really very dependent on Frank, allowing for her to continue that horrible marriage. For Nannie, the abuse was normal, and while she may have dreamed of a romance like she read about, she had no positive examples of a healthy relationship to go off of. While Nannie killed her grandson Robert, her motives were for financial gain, as she was desperate to avoid poverty, unlike her first two children, if she did kill them, when insurance money didn't pay much compared to Robert's. So kind of like opportunity presented itself. Nannie killed Frank after Frank raped her as an act of revenge, while she killed Arlie Lanning for financial gain, plus the house burning down. Nannie killed Arlie's mother, possibly as a loose end, possibly because she just simply enjoys it, possibly because if she has Munchausen syndrome, she enjoys the sympathy of, the grieving widow who also lost her mother-in-law, kind of gained that sympathy. Nannie killed her sister for financial gain. Remember Debbie, who's dying of cancer, for financial gain, and saw opportunity for plausible deniability since she was dying of cancer and bedridden, so perfect opportunity. Plus, she might have just simply been enjoying the crap out of it at this point, because it does appear she's killing more and more frequently. I mean, killing Arlie Lanning's mother just after a very short time after Arlie's actually died kind of seems a bit quick-paced for just financial gain, so she might actually be enjoying it at this point. Similar patterns of escalation where their cooling off periods kind of get smaller and smaller. So one reason that Nannie was able to get away for so long was that she was able to hide behind social norms of domesticity and being a sweet caregiver. As you can see kind of with her giggling persona, it's possible that she really just gripped onto that exterior. Although, given the fact that she desperately wanted a man who would love and respect her, but distrusted them, she kind of desperately gripped to that stronghold of seeming like a sweet, gentle caregiver. Plus, if she did have Munchausen syndrome, that's how she would want to appear, to kind of protect herself and help her support her psyche and unstable state of mind. And plus, Nannie was able to use these norms to deceive people about her. Plus, the fact that she was moving around to different states all over the American South also allowed her to evade capture for quite a while. People around Nannie were conditioned to see her in a kind, loving person and not capable of murder. Nannie's haste to marry again shows that she mainly wanted financial gain, but also was fantasizing about a perfect Prince Charming. Nannie's downfall was being overconfident in Samuel Doss's murder by signing consent for the autopsy, thinking no one would suspect her. Nannie used her persona as a happy housewife and loving mother to mask her greed for money and desire for murder, as well as deep insecurities about herself with a low sense of self-worth instilled from childhood, which is really why she's probably holding on to that happy, smiling, wonderful caregiver persona to help her as a coping mechanism with that deep sense of insecurity. Nannie's constant search for the perfect man with standards no one could fulfill conflicted with Nannie's reality and actual husbands, as none of her husbands were what she wanted and dreamed about, and so she would kill them to kind of probably take control in her own hands, to kind of wipe the slate clean. Greed got in the way. She wanted to avoid poverty more. She was more thinking about herself. Uh, they just weren't perfect. She possibly enjoyed the killing, wanted the Munchausen syndrome. She wanted the sympathy of having a grieving widow. Lot of possibilities. She might have been even revolting against the social norms of domesticity, of females' inferiority and male superiority. That might also have been a possibility. But instead of trying to better her life and find better husbands, she played a superficial role of being a happy housewife and mother until her reality was impossible to ignore. And so she resorted to murder. Most of Nannie's life was going through the motions of true love, happiness, faking it on an external level that would fool her neighbors and herself. So kind of like a pathological liar, she's possibly beginning to believe the lie she's telling, like a pathological liar would. And instead of striving for a better life, Nannie simply killed when reality didn't live up to her impossible expectations. Plus, she might have even enjoyed it. Her husbands weren't the problem. She was. The laughing under the role of a happy wife was created by Nannie to mask her own insecurities and murderous tendencies for money. And her insecurities may have led her to some very deep depression, such as in prison, which she described, "I hope the Lord will take me soon. Time passes slowly here. I have a heavy heart," etc. Kind of see that signs of depression. She might have even been suicidal by proxy, wanting the death penalty. There's been speculations of that, like maybe the Lord will take me soon. There's been speculations of that as well. All right, that concludes the story of Nannie Doss. I will hope you will join me next time as we conclude Volume 3 with the more famous Dennis Rader, also known as the BTK Killer or BTK Strangler, who had a victim count of 10. Thank you. I've been your narrator and the creator of this PowerPoint, Porter Hymas. Please like and subscribe. Leave any comments if you have any suggestions on which serial killer to cover next. I'm looking for material for Volume 4. Thank you and goodbye. I hope to see you next time.